CS to share what they know with students, with members of the public, and in particular with the Sacramento policy community. Our hope is that communicating about UC-produced, research-based evidence will ultimately help support better public policy. But we are also aware that there are many fine policy researchers within the California state government apparatus as well, and today we bring you one of them. Before introducing the speaker, I want to acknowledge actually Irina Edmundson, Chief Economist at the State Department of Finance. She's right here at front. So Dr. Edmundson has worked closely with our center director and staff to bring you today's presentation. In her current position, Irina oversees forecasting of the U.S. and California economies and directs analysis of topics of interest to policymakers. Before assuming her current position, she was a senior economist at the International Monetary Fund and staff economist at the Council of Economic Advisors. And now today's speaker, so Dr. Walter Schwarm. Dr. Schwarm joined the Demographic Research Unit of the California Department of Finance in 2006 and is currently the director of the State Data Center. Prior to his time at the Department of Finance, he served as a postdoc at the Regional Research Institute at West Virginia University. He earned his PhD in economics from Colorado State University, and we are so pleased that he could be here today to do this presentation, so thank you.
Thanks. So, started then. Poverty and housing. I mean, that's a loaded question, and we're going to talk a little bit about poverty to begin with, and then kind of segue our way on towards a little bit about housing and its relationship to some of the features that go with housing. So, first of all, thank you all for having me here today. I think it will be hopefully interesting, and we'll see how it goes from there. I thought I'd start with this particular one, and it's the official poverty rate for California in the United States since 1980. We can see a couple of stylized facts that exist here. Now, official poverty, right, this is the type of rate that the official poverty rate was more or less sort of invented in the early 60s and has everything to do with a basket of food and some general, so it's not perfect, right? It has to do with how much an average family spends on a basket of nutrition. And so it doesn't include housing, and it doesn't include some of the other pieces. But it is what we have used for the official poverty programs since the early 60s. One thing we should see about this is that it hasn't changed much. I mean, it goes up and down, but this band here that it exists in is plus or minus about 2 to 3%. And, you know, that alone should be kind of an issue, thinking about this in the sense that as we're looking here at 37 years of history, this is a relatively difficult thing to deal with. I mean, that should be clear from that. The other thing that comes to note here to a certain extent is California is the yellow line. Ever since somewhere around here in the early 90s, California has generally had poverty that's a little bit higher than the United States. A little bit. I mean, this was particularly a bad period. We had the BRAC closures, so the base realignment closures. We also had more or less the collapse of the California aerospace industry. Yes, our recession in the early 90s was much longer, much sort of deeper, or was more greatly affected California than it did the rest of the United States. And we really developed this kind of wedge during that time period. But most of the rest of the time, California is somewhere close to the nation. After all, we make up, 10% of the nation's population or so. It seems reasonable that we should also be somewhere in there when it comes to that. So there's poverty as it starts. You notice, offhand, I would say, well, every time the two things meet, we have a recession. But that would be predicting recessions. I'm not going to do that. And I'm certainly not going to say anything about the current. At the current time period, we're actually slightly below the nation's average by 1/10 of 1 point. So that's interesting. But yes, as it turns out in this particular thing, it's close. Here's the geographical distribution of poverty in California. And I did this with metropolitan or micropolitan statistical areas, so it doesn't cover the entire state. And that's because I wanted to use one-year data. to show the most current that we have at this particular point in time. So the official poverty rate, which is obviously what government programs are based on, and kind of that headline number that we see in the news as it goes along, has really a great, relatively large variance in California, right? Napa here sits actually at the lowest, at 5.6% of official poverty, and then we end up with this section of the Central Valley where Tulare County is actually the one with the most, at 24.6. It's this one right there, the Visalia-Porterville MSA. There are tracts within that particular MSA or within the Central Valley there that actually have poverty levels that are more than 24.6, poverty levels that are very similar to those found in the depths of Appalachia. And they've had that poverty for a long period of time. So it's, this is a relatively difficult and some way intractable situation. Certainly something that, right, the war on poverty was declared in 1965. We just had, essentially the 30th, the 40th anniversary. We're going into, the 43rd year. I don't know whether any of you saw any of the articles that came out from that general period. And the argument was made there that pretty much, yes, it's better, but on the other hand, we really haven't conquered poverty. And that would be a case here as well. In terms of local areas, right, LA is sitting at around the state average at 14, and Sacramento is around 13. That would, so there's a gap here, obviously, because Sacramento looks a little bit better and LA looks a little bit worse. It appears as if the coast here is much less poor. And from some instances, yes. On the other hand, that's just a base level. It might be interesting to see one of the, obviously this talk is poverty and housing. One of the things that we need to think about on this one is this question of what kind of impact does the local conditions, or do the local conditions have on poverty and on the perception of poverty, or how you are actually feeling it when you are there. In other words, it's one thing being poor, but it's another question about how much of your income are you spending when it comes to just basic shelter versus being poor, not having to pay a whole lot for shelter, and having income there to potentially do other things, some of which may actually may be able to lift you out of poverty. I could go back to those Appalachians. Yes, there are tracts in West Virginia or in Eastern Kentucky that have poverty, 1/3 of everybody, almost 40% of everybody in those tracts are in poverty. They have home ownership rates in the 80 to 90% range. Now, they've owned those homes since 1850 in the family, but that does mean, of course, that they're poor, but they're not paying for shelter. They're able to theoretically move out of that position. Few of them do. Ironically, those homes are somewhat of a burden because the minute that they move to a larger city and have to actually rent a home, they suddenly face the problem that they don't have the skills to earn enough money to actually start paying that rent, and they usually go back to the hollers because it's easier there. So what I've done in this particular one is what happens if we essentially look at housing costs and more or less say, look, this is a ratio of California housing costs versus the U.S. housing costs for a 2-bedroom household with 2 baths and a family of 4, technically. What if we take those poverty rates and we essentially show the burden of household, of rent on them, or the burden of housing costs on them? And you see this makes a really different picture in the sense that the coast suddenly doesn't quite look so rosy. In particular, Los Angeles doesn't look so rosy because these have very high housing costs. And therefore, rent and its overall, and just being in those areas adds to the burden of poverty. There are a few places in the Central Valley that actually look a little bit better or haven't actually changed. The interesting thing, of course, is Santa Cruz now actually has the worst possible poverty at this point, having gained almost 10%. And that should make some sense. It's a coastal community. It has a lot of demand for housing with the university there as well, and it's quite nice and has amenities and various other things that go with that. And indeed, that brings me to the next thing, which is, to a certain extent, this is versus the United States. To a certain extent, maybe that's unfair, because I don't know that in an ideal world with perfect everything, California would have rental prices that would all match the United States. Because we have the coast, we have mountains, we have other amenities, we have job creation centers. There are reasons why people would be willing to spend more in California. And so to a certain extent, this would be the map that I would start to look at a little bit. And this is these regions in California versus California's housing costs. So same thing as the national one, only this is California-wide rental for a 2-bedroom, 2-bath house with a family of 4 in it. And you can see things are, it is worse than the first picture on the coast, right? We can't get away from the fact that the coast, and particularly Santa Barbara here, and Santa Cruz as well, are high-cost places to live. They have also high amenities, and to a certain extent have limits on the amount of area that individuals have traditionally been able to build housing in. What's interesting in these pockets of sort of affordability, notice that Stanislaus ends up being relatively affordable under this idea. With, not saying that being poor in Stanislaus is any better than, it's a great idea, but it does mean that you're probably less burdened by rent and you're more able to spend money on something else compared to an individual, say, in Santa Barbara or Los Angeles or someplace else. Of course, Visalia, Porterville, which is Tulare, still can't escape that depth that it had previously. It's still a relatively poor place, even when we're compensating for relative housing costs. So this brings us from, we'll look at housing in a moment a bit more, but I wanted to point a few stylized more facts about how poverty as it goes along. This is I don't know that we've ever, if you've seen this much, this is a population pyramid. This is the population for those in poverty, divided by their age groups on this side, male in the yellow, female on the blue side. So this is the structure of poverty. This is the age structure of poverty and the gender structure of poverty to a certain extent. We see two things here. First of all, women have higher rates of poverty. For the individuals above 75 to 85, that's because they're widows. And widowers sometimes do not, right, their benefits go down. Pensions and various of the retirement programs don't pay as much once the primary beneficent has died. There are reasons why the elderly, particularly elderly women, find themselves at higher rates of poverty. The rest of this, just about all the way through, and indeed part of the reason children have so much poverty, is single parents. And in particular, single mothers, right? Despite the fact that we've had an increase in single fatherhood, for better or worse, there are still many more single mothers in California than there are single fathers, and many more of those single mothers are indeed in poverty. And that's part of the reason why all of these are a couple of percentage points higher than the male side, and in particular why the children down here seem to be so relatively high, because of course they take on the traits of their parents, and their parents being in poverty means those children are themselves in poverty. This 20 to 24 looks like it has a little spikiness to it, and indeed I wanted to point out that this is the state as a whole. That spikiness is there for a reason to a certain extent. This is Chico, i.e. we see that this band here of increased poverty is actually here, and that's students, of course. One of the things we have to consider is who is in poverty. Now, students living in group quarters, i.e. in the dorms, they don't count. Individuals in jails and prisons, individuals in nursing homes, they don't count in the poverty measures. Poverty is a universe that's only people that are out there. But nevertheless, universities, yes, if you're in university, you're probably, unless you're independently wealthy or a trust fund baby, yeah, you're probably poor. Should we worry about you? Well, it depends, but presumably you have you're investing in your education, and you will not be poor in the future. So yes and no. On the other hand, as you can see here, poverty is not uniformly distributed nicely in pockets, right? In Chico and here, we actually have relatively high levels of male poverty. And that has something to do with the fact that this is a farming community, something to do with the fact that we have a large proportion of individuals that are there as agricultural labor as well, that are not there on the female side of the thing. So poverty is different in different places. And I think we all knew that, but it's sometimes nice to kind of look at it. Well, let's think about, housing and poverty as it goes together. So these are values for 2017. We had 13,000-ish households in California. So that's approximately, the total number of that. About 7 million of them were owners. So, that's a ratio I'll talk about in a moment, the owners versus renters. So about 7 million individuals were in owned homes, but we're going to focus eventually on renters, and this is part of those reasons. I mean, I would claim, 13.7 is a lot of individuals that are paying over 50% of their income for their mortgage, which owners would. But on the other hand, it's kind of trivial compared to the one underneath. And so I'm going to focus more closely on renters as we go along with this, just for that one reason, because this is a much moderate level of thing. And ironically, there are persons in there who are in poverty, obviously, that are in that. But a lot of that is actually sort of upper middle class individuals who have extended themselves into larger homes for whatever reason. And we may not care that they're spending 50% of their income on housing, because they have that remaining 50% of their income is a lot of income. So, great. And I'll show that with one of my graphs. I don't know that we're necessarily always concerned about the fact that there are individuals with lots of income who are paying lots of their money in rent, except for the fact that there's a filtering effect when it goes along. So we look at renters. There's about 5.8 million renters, or maybe 6 million as we go along, and almost 30% of them pay more of their 50% of their income on housing. Well, that's a little bit different. Now we're getting into 1 in 3. And so if we combine these things together, 1 in 5 households in California pay more than 50% of their income on housing. That's pretty significant. So housing is clearly on a point in here. But when we look at the households in poverty, and these are households in poverty, right? California has about 5 million people in official poverty. That translates to about 1.5 million households as it goes along. But of this, the majority of those are renters. It's rather difficult to afford a home when you're poor. Banks tend not to like to lend money to you. And 73% of them pay more than 50% of their income on housing. So once again, obviously, I'm going to focus on that because this is no longer just relatively difficult or bad, but not great, but something that we can truly say that, look, it's a burden. It's a burden that is really very significant for these individuals. Let's look at housing for a moment. This is housing unit growth since 1980. As you notice, there's some stylized facts we can say about this, and I wanted to point this out because we look at the data that I'm talking about in terms of those individuals, and we're going to get to in just a moment about the level of poverty and the 50% of those. That's all stuff sort of from this era right here, mainly because we don't have surveys that deal with the stuff on a many-year basis back here. We didn't yet have that data. But one thing we do see here is we certainly had very large housing unit growth in the late 80s. Okay, we also had very large population moving to California in the late 80s. There was demand for housing. During that recessionary period in the 90s, yeah, okay, you've got lots more people in poverty, you have individuals leaving the state, et cetera. Housing production goes down, then we have the ramp up to the boom, and we have our most recent stuff here at the end. We had always, a comment was made at one particular point in time that this division between multifamily and single-family units. So multifamily units are apartments, duplexes, fourplexes, and then larger apartments of many units. That it was rather unusual coming out of the recession that we'd have about 50% multi-unit and 50% single-family. That's not really that unusual. If we go back to the 80s, we were building a lot of apartment buildings during that particular point in time. The piece that is unusual here, of course, is the red is mobile homes. They were a viable part, at least during this time period, of California's housing solution. They are not starting in 95 or 96, and indeed, I'll highlight that a little bit more. We actually have negative growth as certain areas of the state actually work to eliminate mobile home parks, or at least eliminate mobile homes from within their communities by use of restrictions and zoning regulations, essentially. As perhaps a cautionary tale, although mobile homes are very different because the home versus the pad, and the pad is actually what's being rented. Part of the reason is, or something that contemporaneously happens during the early 90s, is rent control is imposed on a lot of Southern California mobile home communities. in most of the 9 counties in Southern California. In total, about 85 different communities attempt to do pad-level rent control. That made, that changed the dynamic. Let's say it like that. I won't say for better or worse, that changed the dynamic. Since 2010, we have had at least consistent growth during that particular period of time, and in the counties one would expect, in the sense that Riverside, San Bernardino, Tulare, Tehama. So a lot of these Southern California counties where a lot of this growth was in at one point as well. So people are using it again, but to a certain extent, it's clearly it's not a solution that it was at one particular point in time. So let's leave it at that to a certain extent, that mobile homes were important at one time, but don't seem to be that important anymore. But one thing that we do look at when we talk about owner or rentership is there was a time period where, ironically, so we have owners and renters are the yellow and are the two one, and then population is the one sitting in front of them. And as we go with that, now you can see there was a time period where there were more individual owners and that ownership has essentially slowed down over time, and where renting has become more important. And I've got another graph that shows that a little bit better. But probably most interestingly here is this one down here, more or less, which is household size by tenure. The number of persons that are in either owned or rented homes. At one point in time, to rent a house or to rent was to imply that you were probably single or maybe a couple. You certainly didn't have a whole lot of other family members with you. You probably didn't have children with you because your persons per household was relatively low. That has changed over the decades, right? This is the 1980 census, the 1990 census, the 2000 census, 2010, and finally the 2017 ACS. Notice that across this time period, renters look far more like owners during this entire time. And that's because, to a certain extent, the number of owners has declined during this, or the percentage of the population that's able to own a home has declined across this particular period of time. And this leads us to the question of kind of income are these people using. Percentage of income and gross rent for the United States. We can see less than 30% is the yellow underneath. Certainly was fairly affordable in 1990 and 2000, and then as there is a noted change, even in the U.S., in affordability of individuals spending less than 30% of their income. Now, this is not so much, there are two things going on in this graph, of course. There's rental prices, but there's also income. As income fell during the recession too, you end up with having more individuals who are in their old rental thing, but now that their income has fallen, they've actually moved into a higher percentage bracket. But we do see up here for the U.S. that we have this increase here during the recession, and then as income takes off on this side, there are fewer individuals that are spending that much money, more than 50% of their rent on income. This is California on the bottom. You notice that's not the case here. We end up with this significantly higher level of individuals spending above 30% of their income on rent. And unlike the lessening that we see for the U.S., we actually see it growing as time goes on here. And that's probably better seen in this one, is the differential between the two, right? Particularly for the 50% individuals. We see the fact that we're actually clearly, we were always higher than the U.S., but we've actually been pulling away across the last more or less, 10 years in terms of the number of individuals spending more than 50% on rent. So the burden more or less has been increasing. And one of the ways I wanted to show that was with these things. This is sort of Dahlmeyer has talked about these things as well, and I'm kind of cribbing on some of his work that he talked about when these things came along. But what I'm doing here is, in 2000, I'm essentially dividing the population into 25% quartiles. So 25% of the population is spending their that's 25% of the population with that income. This is the next 25% with this income and that one and that one. And same thing with down here. So I'm just dividing it into quartiles, so dividing the population into these are the lowest 25% earners, these are the next highest and next highest and highest. Same thing with the rent down here. Now, Normally, we would inflation adjust as it goes along to maintain quintiles. What I'm doing here is actually I'm actually adjusting these breakpoints by the inflation adjustment and showing how that same level of income or that same level of rent applied with the new level of either income or the new levels of rent. So what we have here is essentially up here in income. As you notice, things move, obviously we got more renters, that's what the graph is doing, but as things move along here, actually we get an increase in the bottom quartile for a while, but then it goes down. This actually shrinks here a little bit at the end, which is to say the middle class, it's about 26% on top. It's about, these two represent about 22 and 23%, and it's about 25 once again on the bottom that are there when we round those things up. So from an income perspective, we haven't had a whole lot of quartiles shift, right? There's a little bit more in the higher income quartile, a few more individuals in the lower income quartile, a few less in the middle. Now when we look at rent has a very different picture in California, right? What was once quarter of these rentals were up here. Already by 2005, we see that beginning to expand a little bit, but it just continues, and particularly in the last 10 years, we see the fact that, look, that value, I think, is 42% of all rent that's being paid in California is actually in this upper quartile. And obviously the ones that have decreased the most here are the most affordable, the least, the lowest quartile, where we're down to, I think, statewide 16% of rental units are in this, are the equivalent level of that was in the lowest quartile before, and in this one where it's, I think, 18% of the units, so losses on those. The idea here, to a certain extent, is if you're in these income groups here in the beginning, you probably, unless you're really crazy, would probably be renting in these groups here because you don't want to overextend the amount of income that you're paying for rent, right? If you're earning in the lower quartile in 2000, you were probably renting in the lower quartile in 2000. But the thing that happens, of course, is you see the quartiles don't move much. However, the number of units that you have available, the availability of units you can rent and still have that same level of affordability has gone down dramatically. And most of them have moved up into this higher income quartile. This is California. It conceals a lot of stuff. We look at the Bay Area. Bay Area, we see particular shrinking of that kind of middle class there. We've had a lot of changes in the Bay Area. And tech has, a lot of manufacturing jobs have left and a lot of other things that would have contributed to that. The middle two quartiles have actually disappeared from the Bay Area job environment. And so we end up with more service jobs in the low end and higher and more tech jobs on top. So we see an expansion of those two income quartiles. We look at rental things here. Once again, we have this shrinking of the ability of individuals to find rents that would have corresponded to the ones that these individuals should have been renting in or would most likely have been renting in. Instead, they're having to rent up. And if they're having to rent into these individuals are having to rent up into these because that has such a high level of growth. This is the Bay Area. That's, you might think, the worst. No, actually, Los Angeles is by far the worst. This is almost a 48%. So almost 48% or almost 50% of all rental units in Los Angeles are essentially what was once the highest quartile, so the most expensive rents back in 2000. This particularly, the lower ones on that one have disappeared considerably as it goes along. And problem with LA is it's not quite the same as the Bay Area. It actually has had not as much high income growth, so we know that that's bearing down on individuals more clearly because, like I said in the beginning, I don't really care if this person up here who is earning $12,000 a month is spending $5,000 a month on housing. It's their decision. They still have, let's call this all after taxes, they still have $7,000 to spend on everything else. That's not terrible. I could live on $7,000 on everything else. It's a problem for the individual earning $2,000 a year, right, a month. If they're spending $1,000 on housing, okay, suddenly $1,000 a month, I'm going to have to really think about how I'm going to live my life. So it isn't so much that this has increased and this has increased. It's the fact that everything along the bottom has shrunk to such a to a level which makes it really difficult or points out the unaffordability issues. Sacramento, similar pattern to LA, ironically, and indeed almost worse because we lag as things go along here, and we actually have a much greater degree of expansion in the lower quartile. That has everything to do with the fact that only recently have essentially sort of state jobs picked up again. We lost a considerable amount of employment during the years of the recession in here, and that represented a whole bunch of those two quartiles, at least in 2000. I'll go to the Central Valley because it's the one that really probably has the most clear idea here. So Central Valley is a little bit different and one I want to highlight because the question, of course, comes, is you notice my earlier pictures, are we really going to be able to change the dynamic of the coast? Yes and no. Rents are going to be, market rents are going to be relatively high there because the amenities are relatively high there. One will have to do something else in order to address affordability issues in the coastal areas. That leaves, Sacramento to a certain Central Valley and this question of, well, is it a production issue? Is it a problem where there's enough housing supply? Is it something else that's in the background? Incomes in the Central Valley. So this is essentially San Joaquin South. So this is really so I'm not using, I know I said Central Valley, but let's not assume, this is not north of Sacramento, it's San Joaquin South of Kern. Income, ironically, you can see it has some changes in the middle of it. But sitting here at the very end, income is almost unchanged. So in other words, we don't see a particular quartile of income growing much higher than everything else, and we don't see that sort of hollowing out-ish of sort of the middle class or in the middle there. So ironically, income is almost unchanged in terms of its quartile distribution since 2000, the base year of this one. Housing is kind of interesting in the Central Valley because almost all of the affordability gap in the sense of the change between what was the highest, the number that were in the highest quartile in 2000 versus those in 2005 happened in the run-up to happened in the run-up to the housing bust. This number up here, and that's because the bust was particularly hard in the Central Valley, and also because of the dynamic. There aren't that many high earners that are there, particularly in a time period where we have problems. And you can see this remains almost the same block, even as the population moves along. Same thing with the gray block as well. We do see a slight decline in the number of units that would be affordable or that would be classified as the lowest quartile rental units. That all changes around here. So it stays essentially almost constant until 2011 and 2012. And I'll talk about the reason why that occurs at that point. So from an affordability perspective, for a rent burden perspective, the Central Valley, and to a certain extent Sacramento, because that we can see a similar pattern in Sacramento where a lot of this rental increase in the beginning, a lot of the change in the rent, in the overall, the rise of the rents is really kind of constant there for a long period of time until sort of the very end of this picture as pressures begin to mount again on the rental side. Should be describing this one down here, right? It's another one where around 2011, 10, 11, 12, we get this expansion in the top half, which we didn't see in the Los Angeles and the other one. Well, when it comes to the Central Valley, first of all, we haven't built a whole lot since then, right? During the pre-recessionary time period, this is about 17% of all California housing production was in the Central Valley. Now it's about 10%. So the number of units being built in the Central Valley is lower. That may be contributing to the affordability issue in the sense that the supply is lower at this particular point in time. You can see the extreme sort of drop off. But even in this period of time where other places were declining, there was still considerable growth occurring in certain Central Valley communities. It's really only in the last couple of years that it should be picking up. It doesn't seem to be doing it yet. This is one of the reasons that we can see. The number of individuals and this is Stanislaus and San Joaquin, that are commuting to the Bay Area, because Here, this is a 20,000 person increase between 12 and 17. For Stanislaus, it's a 5,000 person increase between those two time periods. I could do this with Sacramento, but it's a little less clear in Sacramento. But what we see here, and one of the explanations for the fact that we end up with this idea that the individuals that are living there, they haven't really changed their income quartiles that much. So why do we see this huge change in rental quartiles? It's partially because the income that these individuals are earning isn't local to that area. It's from the Bay Area. And that the housing costs in the Bay Area, as they bleed over into the San Joaquin Valley, end up creating pressure there that wasn't there, that would not normally be there because the local population isn't, there aren't that many of them there, or they wouldn't be applying that rental pressure as it exists. But this is fairly, this is a significant amount when it comes to the Bay Area and working with that. I mean, there's nothing you can do about it, because part of the reason, if we look at the income of these individuals, a vast majority of these individuals are not high earners. They are those two bands in the middle. They are those individuals in the sort of middle quartile and upper middle quartile that used to live in the Bay Area, but are now been driven out by rental costs or by housing costs, and now live in San Joaquin particularly, and also then into Stanislaus, that are now once again commuting, spending 2 hours on the train or on their car, and commuting to those Bay Area jobs that they once were in Bay Area for. We see this a bit in Los Angeles between obviously Riverside and San Bernardino, but not to the same extent that one does here in the Bay Area. So when we look at that, it's like this, right? I mean, here is the location of Bay Area commuters. The Bay Area, which is the 9-county MTC or ABAG unit. The Bay Area, about 200,000, so about 5% of all commuters to the Bay Area commute. And the vast majority of them are commuting, as is reasonable, from San Joaquin. Santa Cruz is technically a slightly shorter commute, but of course it ends up being quite long getting over the pass. And then San Benito and Stanislaus are in there as well. Those seem to be reasonable. They are counties that are around it, but in the same way, they are part and parcel of the reason why those counties have such high rent burdens when we do those housing adjustments, right? The third graph that I gave and showed the fact that, look, housing costs in these communities are really burdensome. Well, they're partially really burdensome because those rents are in some ways disconnected from the jobs from those communities. The jobs are somewhere else, and there's a commuting cost based on that, but there's also an affordability issue, because if you can't engage in that commuting, because either you don't have the car, or you're not close to the train, or your job is in the local community, it really implies that you're not going to be able to compete with these individuals, and therefore you're going to move down a rental level potentially, or you're just going to have to spend more on rent. So it exacerbates the poverty level in some of those communities. It is notable that, I don't have it as a graph up here, but San Joaquin is the only county between 2016 and 17 that, when we do the housing cost adjustment piece, actually gained in poverty, because more units were actually level, gain in the poverty, in the compensated thing, because more units were actually harder to rent than they were in 2016. Most of the rest of the state, as you notice, those graphs kind of taper off, because yes, rental price increases have slightly reduced themselves across the last couple of years. Or not last couple of years. Over the last year, the increase in rental prices has been a little bit slower. How about that? And we see that in almost every place except for San Joaquin, because the driver is still there. The individuals are still trying to find their way out of the Bay Area housing thing and into their own. So there are, kind of as a summary at the end of this one, there are challenges and obviously costs with these various things. Clearly, there are, one of the things that we need to consider, of course, in terms of this, is this all cleaned up by producing more housing, producing more rental units? Difficult to say. I mean, one of the things that exist in all of this, in particular in those coastal communities, is permit fees impact fees, various other fees that are associated with it, they drive the cost prior to even constructing a house fairly high. And if you count land costs, we're into at least $150 to $175, maybe even $200,000. That's before you put anything on the piece of property. Then you build a house. You've got to, there's construction costs, there's lumber costs, those have been going up. You want to make a profit because housing is, of course, a profitable item. And it comes to the case that most builders will actually argue they can't make any reasonable profits unless they're selling the house for $380,000 or $400,000. That's not an affordable house, particularly if we're thinking about this for those proportions of individuals that are near poverty or, well, let's say near poverty, because it's not, right, housing and a couple of these things isn't the solution to poverty, right? Because poverty has its own problems and its own cause. Education, there are many forces that are in the background when it comes to that drive poverty. Opportunity and education and outright racism in some instances, and also just institutional things that stick in there. But one of the pieces that drives people close, I mean, if we do that compensating, when I compensate and put people into poverty, if I use the housing price compensation, that adds almost 1 million people to poverty. Now, that's not the official rate, but that's how many people end up acting poor or being poor because they're spending more than 50% of their income on housing. When you do that, that is a problem to a certain extent. A solution for which, who knows? That's something, that needs to be examined to a certain extent. But housing is clearly a component of it. And it is a difficult one because it is really going to be the amenity push. And like I say, California has had higher housing prices for a very long period of time. The coast has always had higher housing. It has amenities. It looks nice. People want to live there. It's a matter of trying to figure out policies that will actually allow for individuals in those bands to maintain a peace there. Because as you notice, I could go back to 90 with those. I think not much had changed. So the affordability of the Bay Area between 90 and 2000, it's not great, but it doesn't have that radical change like we see between 2000 and 2017, where we have this, certainly not in LA. LA is far worse than it ever was before, with 49 or 50% of all rental units being in that uppermost quartile, i.e. what should be well beyond the reach of anybody reasonably looking to rent, if they're not intent on spending 50% of their income on the rent. And honestly, there are very few individuals who are actually going out there going, yes, I want to spend 50% of my income on rent. There are few, but not too many. So, thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Schwarm. What an excellent presentation. And we're going to